Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 2nd of December 2025. Today we're starting our sessions discussing the budget of last week, and our first session is with the Office for Budget Responsibility. Obviously today we had expected to have the then Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility, Richard Hughes, as a witness. As we all know, yesterday he resigned following the publication of the Hogg Review into the inadvertent release of information about the budget last Wednesday before the Chancellors had spoken. I do want to take this opportunity to put on record this committee's thanks for his stewardship of the OBR over the last 5 years. In that time, of course, he was appointed during COVID. He also had to handle the challenges of the mini-budget, and we were very pleased to reappoint him to that position in May. So we wish him well in his future career. We're also clear as a committee of the vital importance of the OBR in our system and strongly defend its independence. And we will obviously have a role in appointing his successor. We're not planning today, I should say to our witnesses, to discuss the Hogg Review because it only came out yesterday, and we recognise that it itself recognised that there needs to be more work done to ensure that the OBR has more secure systems in future. So we'll be calling witnesses from the OBR, maybe you, whoever that may be at the time, in some point in the new year to discuss what the next stages of that are. So we won't be discussing that today because we recognise that you won't have any answers. So Mr. Joseph, did you want to just say anything about that?
Could I just say one thing, Chair, and thank you for your words there. I did just want to say on behalf of the leadership of the OBR, and I know also on behalf of Richard Hughes, that we would like to apologise to this committee, to all members of Parliament and to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister about the early release of the document on 26th of November. We do know that this was hugely disruptive to two hugely important parliamentary events, Prime Minister's questions and the Chancellor's budget statement. We completely understand the importance of those events for parliamentarians and for the public. We also really understand the work and the care that goes in across government from the Chancellor down into the presentation of the budget statement. So everyone at the OBR deeply regrets that this happened. As you say, you have the report of the investigation into this, into what happened and how we can make sure it never happens again. And we would also like to thank Baroness Hogg, Dame Susan Rice, Professor Kieran Martin and the whole team for producing that report. And you can just be clear that David and I are fully committed to implementing all of the recommendations in the report to ensure this never happens again.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Joseph. So I think we'd expect nothing less, and we do want to get into the detail of how you secure your information in future, but recognise that you won't have had the chance to have enacted anything in that report, which itself recognised more work needed to be done. I'd like to welcome then our witnesses from the OBR today. We have, you've just heard from Tom Josephs, who's a member of the Budget Responsibility Committee, and we have also Professor David Miles, who's a member of the Budget Responsibility Committee. So thank you very much for coming. I just wanted to start, if I may, with the letter that you wrote to this committee, which was mentioned in the forecast documents last Wednesday, and which we received on Friday. So how unusual was this budget process this time around, including the information that came into the public domain, and when? Professor Miles.
I think we felt that there was a need in that letter to set the record straight on the process by which the forecasts were created at the OBR, and in particular to remove some misconceptions about them that we saw circulating in the media. We know that this committee has a strong, legitimate interest in our processes and how they're done, and so you deserve to know things. And we were planning to wait until immediately after the budget to release the letter that came to you. The reason it came late was that, as we all now know, there was an unfortunate incident, early access by some parties to our document, and so we were spending most of the immediate aftermath of the budget dealing with that, trying to set up the panel to investigate investigate it, and therefore the letter didn't come to you until slightly later than that. I think it might have appeared to some reading the media that the OBR came under certain pressure and may have acceded to that pressure on several things. For example, moving the window that we use to assess market expectations of interest rates in a direction which might have been helpful to the government. There was some speculation over that. I think there was some speculation that we had somehow helpfully come up with some extra money, some funds fallen down the back of the sofa, so to speak, at the last minute. I think there was also a view that the OBR's forecasts were wildly fluctuating in the process, both leading up to the pre-measures forecast and perhaps after it as well, and that had made the budget process more chaotic than it otherwise would have been. And so we were keen to set the record straight on some of those things. Some of it is very straightforward. For example, the window that we chose to use to set market expectations of interest rates, which has quite a significant impact on the assessment of where debt interest costs are going into the future, had been decided on, I believe, back in July. So there was no sense in which that was shifted at the last minute to try to find a window that might be particularly helpful. I think it was also important to set out that in the lead up to the final pre-measures forecast, which went to the Chancellor right at the end of October, there hadn't been wild fluctuations in our assessment of the outlook. They had gradually got a little bit more favourable in the sense that the margin, or the headroom as people call it, looked like it dipped from slightly negative to ever so slightly positive. But there were no wild fluctuations in those things.
We've seen that obviously in the letter on the table, which I should say, of course, that information is in the EFO every year anyway, most of it. What was new in the letter that you sent us, just so people are clear?
Yes, what was new in the letter, it's a matter of record in the EFO, as you're well aware, Chair, that we show what the pre-measures estimate of the so-called headroom is.
What I'm saying is some of this information was not new, it's just put together in the letter.
Quite so. What was new was just to show the preliminary forecasts that led up to that number.
1 and 2.
Correct. Which had improved by relatively small amounts as we went through the rather long iterative process of producing the forecast in the lead up to that October 31st number, that there were no wild fluctuations there. In fact, they were by the standards.
Really, it was 1 and 2 that
small.
was the new bits, right? Okay, can I just, I've also got some quick fire questions,
Sure.
if I may. So, did you or anyone on the Budget Responsibility Committee complain to the Treasury about any leaks of information?
I don't think there was any formal complaint. We were obviously aware that information seemed to be getting into the press. It wasn't.
There was no formal request, but did you talk to the Permanent Secretary, anyone in the Chancellor's office about this?
I think that it was clear that there was lots of information.
I mean you, the OBR.
Yeah, that there was lots of information appearing in the press, which perhaps wouldn't normally be out there, and that this wasn't, from our point of view, particularly helpful.
Yes, well, that's a fact. A fact. You say that. But did anyone from the OBR raise it?
I think it was clear that we didn't find this helpful. We made that clear.
Can you tell us who you raised it with? The OBR raised it
with Treasury officials. You'll appreciate that we have regular meetings during the process of producing.
And when did you start raising those concerns?
I think certainly during the lead up to the pre-measures forecast, when there was speculation, some of these misconceptions, as I've described them, were appearing in the press, and we made it clear that they were not helpful, and that we weren't in a position, of course, to put them right.
And what response did you get when you raised these concerns?
I think there was a recognition that this wasn't terribly helpful as well.
It's all very
This
genteel.
is with-
Very
this-
genteel. So you
this is
raised
with-
concerns generally with the Treasury.
With
Yeah.
Treasury officials, I should say. These meetings.
So did you suspect then maybe where the leaks were coming from?
It was very hard to say. I mean,
Are you aware that Treasury officials tried to do anything to, put the word out to stop future leaks?
I don't have any direct evidence of that.
Okay. And when did you then decide to pull together the information and include the information about rounds 1 and 2 in a letter to the Treasury Select Committee? Because obviously this would have been published, or the EFA was published sometime before the budget, or finalised, the text would have been finalised.
So you mean
The letter that
decide to write the letter?
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I think from memory, we started producing a draft. Richard produced a draft. We looked at it and commented on it quite soon before the budget. Maybe, I mean, it could have been in the final week or two.
Okay, so not long before the EFA was, because the hard copy would have been published presumably 3 or 4 days before the budget itself.
Yeah, I mean, very close to the budget
and
itself.
when did you ask? When did you talk to the Treasury about publishing the letter? Because it's very clear the letter that that this is agreed with the Treasury that this letter.
Yes,
is
the letter was agreed with the Treasury, or the Treasury agreed that we should release the letter. Keen to do so in a way that didn't set a precedent, that this would now happen routinely, that we would show many different rounds of forecasts, that we would not do that in general, but it was in the context of misconceptions that were out there, which was unusual and we hope will not happen again.
So who at the Treasury agreed with the OBR that this letter should be published?
I mean, my impression was Richard obviously was dealing directly with people in the Treasury about that. I think it certainly went to senior officials in the Treasury.
As far as the Permanent Secretary, or yeah, John Joseph says nodding. Yeah,
I believe so.
Yeah, Richard talked about it with the Permanent Secretary.
okay. And did any members of the Budget Responsibility Committee or the committee as a whole consider commenting or correcting any information in the public domain in the run-up to the budget? You sort of touched on that. You said you can't comment, but did you consider breaking that normal practice?
No.
For the record, the witnesses are shaking their heads. And did the OBR undertake any leak inquiry in your own organisation to ensure that any of the leaks about the budget had not come from within the OBR?
We made it very clear to everybody in the OBR right from the outset, and repeated it throughout the whole process, that we do not leak information about the budget process. And I don't think there's any evidence at all that happened.
So you're absolutely confident it didn't come from you. You've talked about the concerns about the public debate in the run-up to the budget in general. Are you particularly concerned? I mean, some of this is market sensitive. There are issues about obviously a lot of politics swirling around. What were your major concerns about the information going into the public domain?
I think that there were, as I said earlier, described as misconceptions. One, that the OBR itself was a source of difficulty by our forecast gyrating enormously in short periods of time, which, I mean, had it happened, would have made it a much more difficult process than it was. It was always going to be a difficult budget. That would have made it more difficult. I think we were particularly keen to make it clear that the specific decision on the window for the interest rates was not under pressure to somehow pick a particular period that was advantageous when gilt yields might have been unusually low.
Dame Harriet.
Yes, thank you very much for clarifying some of this. And it seems to me that the most damaging moment in this whole period was the evening of the 13th of November in the morning of the 14th of November, because the gilt market moved very dramatically when it first heard the information about the fact that there might be some positive news in the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast that was not just the productivity issue. And so it's helpful that you've clarified that the window wasn't during that period, but are you concerned that during the period until the Treasury clarified that there was some positive changes to the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast to the markets on the morning of the 14th of November, that there was a false market in gilt prices in the run-up to that moment?
think our concern was that there seemed to be a misconception that there'd somehow been some bad news. Now, I don't know quite where that, sorry, some good news, rather. And I'm not sure where that came from. I mean, it didn't exist. What had happened was that the forecast for headroom had gradually improved a little bit in the lead up to the 31st of October. But we weren't aware of giving any extraordinarily good news after that.
Potentially between the 31st of October, when you gave your final numbers, and that moment when it emanated from an organisation that you're saying is not the Office for Budget Responsibility, that there was some good news in your forecasts that would offset the productivity downgrade. Potentially during that 14-day window, there was a false market in gilt prices.
Well, I'm not sure how much attention people were paying
the market moved when the information was confirmed to the markets.
I don't think there was a particular concern in the OBR that there'd been overt market manipulation so that people would be misled about the state of the finances. The fact that that there was a story that the news was slightly better seemed in part to be a reflection of an earlier perception that the inflation outlook was a bit stronger and wages were a bit stronger. And it was true that that was the case. But most of that, in our forecast, most of that had already been factored in by October the 31st. Now, whether or not there was a kind of delayed response to that in the wider world is a bit difficult to judge for me.
Sorry to keep pushing on this, but I think it is an important point. If the Chancellor says one thing on the 4th of November about the bad news in the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast, but does not mention some of the offsetting good news, potentially during that window, maybe starting on the 4th of November, but certainly she had the information from the 31st of October until the Treasury clarified things on the 14th of November in a way that moved the gilt market. There must have been a false market in gilts, mustn't there, Professor Miles?
My interpretation was, and others might interpret differently, that the Chancellor was saying that this was a very difficult budget and very difficult choices needed to be made. And I don't think that that was in itself inconsistent with the final pre-measures assessment we'd been made, which although it showed a very small positive amount of so-called headroom, it was wafer thin. I think I described it afterwards in an interview immediately after the budget as a sliver. The fact that it was a positive number, we're very keen to be clear on this now, did not in any way suggest that the OBR assessment was that the fiscal outlook was problem-free and that there was no case for a substantial tightening in fiscal policy. In part, may I briefly explain why? The plus £4 billion number hadn't taken account of something that we absolutely were going to take account of, and it was well known in government that we were, which was the reversal in some of the welfare decisions, the decision to not cancel the winter fuel payment to pensioners, and the reversal on the PIP measures and other sickness benefits. That was always going to count as a post measures because it had come after the March statement, and that was going to make the fiscal position of the order of £7 billion worth just in itself, and that furthermore, the government, I think, had been pretty clear that they agreed with us that £10 billion of headroom was wafer thin anyway. Since it was inevitable that that would turn other things equal into a negative number, and that was known on the 31st when they got the pre-measures forecast, if the government had decided that it wanted to build up the headroom to a much larger number, even than the 10 billion, it was clear from our numbers that that would mean other things equal, that they had to find through a fiscal tightening of the order of, £20 billion or more fiscal tightening.
My point, Professor Miles,
Yes.
if I may, for the last question, between the time when we were told by the Chancellor of the bad news And the moment on the 14th of November when the Treasury had to clarify to the gilt market because they reacted so badly that there was good news in the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts, the impression that was created was a false one, wasn't it?
Well, it's certainly true that there wasn't any immediately good bit of news in that particular window.
Yes, it was
I don't think it was misleading for the, if I may, my own view, I don't think it was misleading for the Chancellor to say that the fiscal position was very challenging at the beginning of that week. Whether a message was then put out to say, well, it's less challenging by the end of the week, I don't know, and I don't know where that message would have come from. It certainly didn't reflect anything that was news from the OBR being fed into the government.
Are you saying that the Treasury briefing that good news received from the OBR had driven the decision to reverse income tax, a proposed income tax?
I honestly couldn't tell you what drove that decision.
Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I think the critical piece of information everyone focused on in your letter was that final pre-measures estimate and the date that it was released. And you've helpfully clarified to the Chair already that that's actually published in EFO every time.
Yes, correct.
Correct. And so we were always going to find out that piece of information eventually.
True.
But you see that the unusual step was to publish the prior forecasts.
Correct.
And you feel a need to protect them in the future. Can you explain why?
Because I don't think it's helpful for the wider world to be, being fed information week by week, which is happening as we iterate toward a forecast.
But at the publication of the EFO, you already tell us the dates.
The EFO will always tell you the date, and it will give you the number pre-measures. But to provide a kind of running commentary on all the steps that get you there, which do move around, isn't particularly helpful. The reason why I think it was felt helpful to show those particular numbers on this occasion was there seemed to us to be a misconception that the OBR was in some sense adding to the difficulties of this budget by its own forecast fluctuating by enormous amounts almost from one week to the next, and that didn't happen.
Could you explain to us why they might fluctuate between events?
Oh, I mean, they might fluctuate as a result of, for example, an enormous increase in oil prices, a collapse in equity prices, a announcement of an enormous increase in tariffs on the UK. So there's all kinds of economic shocks that can come, almost in the space of a few days, that it's perfectly right that we then take notice of and update.
So I want to know why it's not right for our committee after the event, not running commentary throughout the process, not to have that information to hand going forward.
Do you mean in real time?
No, I mean on the publication of the EFO, you already published the dates of the.
Yes, so I see what you mean.
You could have the figures that sit by that with explanations about why it went up and down in your forecast. Why can't we have that?
I mean, it could be that that's a sensible way to go. I mean, we're not. But all I'm saying really is that we weren't setting a precedent and saying that that's how things should be.
Fortunately, I think you might have set a precedent. I can see Tom Joseph's coming in.
Maybe just to add, particularly on the fiscal forecast, to explain the way that the process works. It is always essentially a very iterative process. We actually start looking at the fiscal forecasts way back in the summer, where we try and do a kind of review of all the models that feed into the fiscal forecast, both on the tax and spending side. And there are hundreds of different models that are run by HMRC and by analysts in government departments on the fiscal forecast. And the reason we have a number of different pre-measures rounds is because it takes some time to get through all of those forecasts and really refine those forecasts. So we'll be given an initial view from HMRC, for example, on the tax forecast. OBR staff will go back with a lot of questions and challenge on the forecast that we've been given. And we will eventually agree with HMRC to make changes. Those changes will be incorporated in subsequent rounds, and we go forward on an iterative process until we reach what we think is a central pre-measures round. So you know, there are just a huge number of different factors, some of them very small, some of them much bigger, that will be driving change at each of these pre-measures forecasts.
Can I focus on the interest rate window part? So you said that didn't move, it was set early in the summer. So when was that? Can you just clarify what the interest rate window was?
We decided it in July, set the windows, didn't change after that. I think I'm right in saying that they were the 10 days up to October the 10th for the economy assumptions about where gilt yields and market expectations of the Bank of England interest rates would move. And it was a couple of weeks later, I think the 21st of October window, the 10 days up to the 21st of October, for the fiscal forecast. And the reason why the fiscal numbers had a later window than the economy numbers was that the economy analysts in the OBR need longer to work through all the implications of interest rate movements. On the fiscal side, and Tom will correct me if I get this wrong, on the fiscal side, it's a little bit more straightforward calculation because you know what the stock of government debt is and where that's likely to be going. And it's just a question of, in a sense, applying a new set of expectations for gilt yields and the Bank of England rate to a stable stock of debt and getting an estimate then of the purely fiscal effects.
I can see someone's come in, but just explain the question. Obviously, this is known to the government, and the government's communications can actually affect some of these markets, as we've seen, and as Dame Harriet Baldwin was alluding to. Do you fear that at any point during the cycle that the government communications could end up affecting the end OBR figures?
Well, they'd have had to be very clever and work out, you know, what kind of information to give on which particular days to try and manipulate the yields in a particular direction. And I'd be surprised if people thought that that could be successfully done, even if they had a mind to try and do it.
Mr. Josephs.
Just wanted to add one thing, which is why we chose to take this later window for the fiscal forecast. And that was because we have agreed with the Treasury that we would close our pre-measures forecast earlier than has been the case in the past to allow the Treasury more time to finalise their policy package. But because we were therefore closing the pre-measures forecast earlier, we had some concerns that would mean that the window we were taking for interest rates would be out of date, essentially. So that is why we decided this time to take that later window for the fiscal forecast for interest rates. As David said, you know, we agreed that early in the process. We communicated it to the Treasury in September. So, you know, it could have gone either way, if you like. At this event, it turned out to be slightly favourable to the Treasury, but that was obviously not necessarily going to be the case.
Final question, if I may. Professor Miles, you spoke about how the news story broke that there'd been some change to the OBR forecast, and it was around about the time that it was widely reported that the income tax rate proposal had been dropped. Is the real reasons for the letter that you as an institution felt like you were being used as a political tool in the discussion?
I think it was more that there were misconceptions out there that were wrong and actually damaging to the OBR, that we had exceeded to pressure at certain points, for example, on the window, that we had helpfully found some money at the last minute, that our forecasts were all over the shop and were just making it chaotic for the government to make any decisions. I think it was more, these things were both wrong and damaging to the OBR and to the process.
Thank you very much. John Glenn, MP.
Professor Miles, do you think the scene setter that the Chancellor held in number 11 and the wide understanding that that meant income tax was going up was a reasonable response to the final measures 4.2 billion that you'd handed over 4 or 5 days before?
I think the 4.2 billion number, a positive number, so that the central guess as to where the margin would be 4 years down the road, was by a tiny margin, just the right side of zero, was actually not a number, at the risk of repeating myself, was not a number that we in the OBR in any way wanted to be interpreted as this is very, very good news, there is no hole to fill, as people were saying.
Do you think it was sufficiently bad news
Well,
to justify the way it was presented on the 4th of November?
Well, I think it posed a significant fiscal challenge to a government that wanted to increase the headroom, and I think it was pretty clear.
That wasn't the justification given on that occasion, was it?
Well, I mean, I can't remember the Chancellor's words. I think
she didn't talk about headroom, did she?
Well, I think the message was more, but you know, the Chancellor will speak for herself, of course. I thought the message was more, this is a very challenging fiscal position, and all I am saying is that a number that was plus 4 billion in the pre-measures forecast is not inconsistent with that, the statement, the sentiment that this is a very challenging fiscal position. Because in order to get from there, given that it was going to go from plus 4 to something like minus 3, definitely, because we already knew that we had to take into account the reversals that had happened on winter fuel payments and PIP. It was definitely going to go from plus 4 to minus 3, just holding everything else constant.
But there's a difference, surely. I mean, I understand your characterisation of the bits that were missed out of the 4.2 billion.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference, surely, between saying we need to have some headroom to make up some extra headroom because 10 was too thin.
Yeah.
And increasing taxes by 26 billion for many welfare measures.
Well, I think the arithmetic. I'm not in a position to speculate on what message was the government was trying to get across and how that might have changed. I can just talk you through the arithmetic. I mean, if you start out with plus 3, you know it's going to go to minus 4. Sorry, plus 4 goes to minus 3.
Yeah.
And you said, how much do you then need in fiscal tightening to get back to the 10 billion which had been there in March? You need.
Introducing Continental Special. इसकी shade grown Arabica blend and perfectly medium roasted. Na kam na zyada. Enjoy the smoothest coffee from Continental Special. Itni smooth coffee. Aur kaha.
A very small number given the uncertainty, and you thought you were trying to get to 20 rather than 10. Instead of needing 13 billion pounds of fiscal tightening, you would need 23 billion pounds of fiscal tightening. That's quite a challenge, and therefore the message that it was difficult was not inconsistent with the plus 4 number. I'm saying no more than that.
Right. Okay. So can I just go back to the letter? When did the OBR decide they were going to signify in the EFO they were going to write a letter?
I mean, maybe Tom can help me.
It was about a week before the budget.
My recollection was that it was quite close to the budget.
What was the sort of event that sort of precipitated that decision? Because you've clearly seen weeks and months of characterisation of the OBR's position in the media, presumably from leaks, which I think you've alluded to. What was it that actually finally made that happen, and something that hadn't happened before?
Well, I think it was this. I mean, we were reading stories in the press. Everybody could see them about OBRs come up with some favours to the government. It was under pressure. It acceded to them. It moved the windows. And a different range of stories. The OBRs all over the place. The OBR is the source of the difficulties in finalising the budget. I mean, all of that just kept carrying on. And as I say, sorry, at the risk of repeating myself, the letter really was to try and remove misconceptions about the OBR being either the patsy that was doing what the government wanted, or that through its own fickle behaviour, changing from one day to the next, depending on whether it was sunny or cloudy, that was making it virtually impossible.
That wasn't the case
for the government. No, it wasn't the case. And indeed, the letter, I think, showed that in the run-up to pre-measures, that wasn't the case.
But my last question, if I may, is due to the very unfortunate, with huge implications, the leak pre-budget last week, we see that Richard Hughes is not here today. But the truth is, that letter was about something completely separate to that event, which is about essentially the level of trust between the Treasury officials and the OBR in the preparation of a budget for our country. Where do you think we are now in terms of that relationship? Because it's pretty important for the public to understand where that relationship is. It's pretty difficult to see that you're having a good relationship that's set fair for the future.
Professor Miles.
Well, I wouldn't say we're at war with the Treasury. I mean, we have a very close relationship with the Treasury. In fact, we rely not just on the Treasury, but other departments in government for analysis of many sorts of measures, the DWP, HMRC, as well as the Treasury. And there are lots of very good, from my point of view, economic analysts in the Treasury, and we rely heavily upon them.
I agree with that.
I hope we can run a process in the future, and we'll do everything we can, that it's somewhat smoother than the process we've just been through then.
Thank you. Just before we move to Mr. Grady, how did the Treasury react?
Mr. Joseph wants to
Sorry, on that point. Sorry, Mr. Joseph.
Well, I was just going to add on this point that it is the nature of our role as essentially a watchdog to have a kind of, you might call, creative tension with the Treasury. We are not doing our job if we are not having disagreements with the Treasury on analysis, if we're taking different judgments from the Treasury, and which in many cases they will disagree with. And so that is always part of the process. I think we have, over time, built up a way of doing that, while also having the sort of positive relationship you need to have in order to produce a budget together. So we can combine being tough.
Feels rather different this time, though, Mr. Joseph.
I think we combine being tough in the messages we give and not pulling our punches with being able to work with the Treasury constructively. And, we will be very much looking to do that in the future.
Can I just ask, just find on the letter before I pass to Mr. John Grady,
Thank you,
how did the Treasury act when they heard you were sending the letter? So you talked to them about it, and it's clear in the letter that you had discussed it with them.
Yeah, we discussed it with them, and as it says in the letter, they did agree that it should be sent.
Were they cock a hoop about that? Or?
Well, you'll have to ask them about that. I think
okay.
They agreed to send it.
Did you have to do any sort of deal that you didn't go out publicly during the process, or would you have even considered going out publicly during the process?
I mean, absolutely not. No
okay.
deals.
Thank you. That's just for clarity. Thank you, John Grady, MP.
Professor Miles, you've explained that the leaks and endless speculation about this budget, which seems to have been a lot greater than any budget I remember, is not helpful, and you've focused, I think, in particular on confidence in the process and confidence in the OBR, with different views being cast on the OBR. But there's a real world out there of businesses and consumers who also have to deal with this endless speculation. What quickly, because we need to move on from leaks, quickly, this endless speculation, leaks, all the rest of it, is that damaging to the economy and damaging to businesses and consumers as an economist?
Well, I think uncertainty generally is not helpful to most economic decisions. People will postpone decisions. They may decide to hold off on investments, and removing uncertainty on the whole is a good thing. Of course, it was inevitable, given the date of the budget was where it was, that uncertainty would last for some months in the lead up to that. That was almost inevitable. But it may well have been exacerbated by leaks which, some days seem to be suggesting one thing and the next day something different. And I don't think that kind of helped.
It would damage growth, all other things being equal, even in a small sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit hard to quantify, because even in the absence of any story speculating about this measure and that measure, I think it was pretty clear that the budget was going to be a difficult one, and that because of what had happened in the economy and because the headroom had been very small before, it was quite likely that there would need to be tax increases. So it wasn't as if there was an absence of bad news in some sense coming down the road, but I think it was exacerbated in its effect on uncertainty by stories about, well, it could be that measure, it could be this measure. I don't think that helped.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bobby Dean MP.
Thank you. So in the previous budgetary process in the spring, we obviously had the late adjustment to welfare policy scoring, and it seems to have prompted a change this time round with the movement towards one assessment of the performance against fiscal rules with two forecasts. Can you explain to me what the impact of this decision will be? Perhaps you.
So this is the Chancellor's announcement that at the spring forecast there will not be an official assessment against the fiscal rules, and that is designed to support the Chancellor's aim of just having a single fiscal event. So we will change some of the presentation in our report to reflect that. We will continue to very transparently produce a full economic and fiscal forecast over 5 years, which will include forecasts for all of the fiscal aggregates, and that will include those aggregates that the government currently targets in its fiscal rules. But we will not produce a formal assessment, if you like, a sort of yes or no, as to whether the government is achieving its fiscal rules, and will therefore make some changes in the presentation of the current chapter in the report, which is basically focused on that question of whether the government...
Will you come to that figure internally but not publish it?
Well, so we will publish, as I say, all of the information on the public finances, including forecasts for...
My question is, will you determine the figure but just not put it in the EFO this time?
Well, the number for the current balance will be in the EFO, the number for public sector net financial liabilities. So the two measures will both be in the book, but there will not be a formal assessment of whether or not the government is meeting its targets. But the numbers will be there.
So ordinarily, as you know, the Treasury Committee has the OBR and we have economists in before we have the Chancellor in. Will the economists be able to tell us the answer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So in reality, you're not making a formal assessment, but we're still going to have that assessment. The speculation will remain the same. The reaction to that figure will probably remain the same.
Well, the numbers will be there. I think what we will try and do in the report is provide some more context, because we'll have a bit more space and time to be able to do that, to explain some of the kind of uncertainties around those numbers and some of the risks ahead of the autumn budget, which is when the formal assessment of the rules will take place. I think the idea here, which is actually a sort of model that is followed in many countries actually, is that the spring forecast would be more of a kind of preliminary view, set the grounds for the government to think about its policy settings ahead of the autumn budget when they make their final policy decisions and the formal assessment against the rules is made. So I think we would aim to use the spring forecast document to try and provide more of that context, risks, uncertainties ahead of the autumn.
So I understand the sentiment. I know that the IMF kind of made recommendations to this effect and they want to sort of de-emphasise the concept of headroom in public debate. But I guess the reality is, if they're seen to be off track and there is no repair made in that spring statement, the market's going to react accordingly, aren't they?
Well, as I say, the numbers will be there, and it will be for the government. The government has said it will not respond, I think, unless there are exceptional circumstances, I think is the language they've used. But as I say, I mean, this is not an unusual way to run a fiscal calendar and a fiscal process. It is very similar to the approach that is used in many countries around the world, where you have a sort of single main fiscal event where policy is changed and a preliminary forecast ahead of that.
Yeah, just to say, to quote back Richard Hughes, former OBR chair, what he told the Treasury Select Committee in July, he said that moving to a single annual forecast would make us one of the least fiscally transparent countries in Europe. So do you think the fact that there's still two forecasts but the lack of formal thing means that statement doesn't hold true now?
Yeah, Richard was talking there about a proposal to just have one forecast a year, which would be a big reduction in transparency, and I mean that would be very different from nearly every other country around the world, which has two full forecasts every year. But that, I mean, that is not the proposal that the Chancellor has made.
Just a final thing from the IMF report, they said in July 2025 that one of the strategies that you could take is to have proactive communication to manage market expectations, continue to telegraph and explain policy changes. Do you think that the government listened to that particular element this time around, and that was the reason behind a lot of the information getting to the newspapers early?
I mean, you'd have to ask the government about their communication strategy. That's not for me.
Definitely swerve, Mr. Joseph. Dame Harriet.
But further to that exact question, given the revealed preference that we've seen during this budget process of the Treasury wishing to spin various different aspects of the economic and fiscal information they're getting from the Office for Budget Responsibility, does this change to one forecast not make the markets much more vulnerable to being manipulated with spin from the Treasury in the meantime?
I mean, I don't think, I don't really see why that would be the case. I mean, this is not, I say, the government's communication strategy is not a matter for us. We are just focused on producing the reports that we're required to produce under the legislation, and we will obviously abide by the change that the government is making.
Thank you. You and the MP.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for coming before us this morning. Mr. Josephs, I wanted to go back to a point that you both touched on very briefly in terms of the fluctuations between rounds of forecasts.
Yep.
And from my reading, the change between round 1 and round 3, so all the pre-measures rounds, is about 6.7 billion. Am I right in calculating that between the first and the third round?
That's right.
Do you have a sense of whether that's large or small compared to previous round 1 to round 3 fluctuations?
I think these are generally, I would say these are generally rather small changes compared to some of the fluctuations you see between forecast rounds. Partly because we have been trying to actually introduce more stability into the forecast through a couple of routes. One is that on the economy side, we do our supply stock takes in the summer and take the big judgment on productivity, which we took this time early, so we've taken that right at the start of the process. On the fiscal side, we've also initiated, or further developed, I should say, a process of engaging with HMRC and the other forecasters in the summer to agree any big modelling changes at that point. So we try and get that into the first round so that subsequent rounds are more stable. Because we do very much understand that for the government, trying to develop policy in an environment where the numbers are moving does make it difficult. I mean, sometimes it's unavoidable because there will be new data that come out either on the economy side or on the fiscal side that means that just, the numbers are going to change substantially and there's nothing you can do about that.
So in this case, the 6.7 billion fluctuation from round 1 to round 3 is actually smaller than what it might have been in the past when your forecasts were more unstable. I'd be very curious, perhaps in a letter, if you could set out the volatility from previous rounds that we've not had the ability to see, following from Mr. Dean's comments on having this historical data, if that's...
We can discuss that.
And can I clarify a figure from the EFO itself? You write about a 21 billion average absolute pre-measures forecast revision to borrowing. Is that 21 billion the amount of difference between different 6-month forecasts? Am I reading that correctly?
That's right, yeah.
Right, so
from one forecast to the next, yeah.
So between one 6-month forecast to the next, the average absolute revision pre-measures is 21 billion pounds. So that's quite a large part of historical and current.
Yeah, and I mean that does just reflect the uncertainty around any fiscal forecast, and obviously over the last 15 years the OBR has been in existence, there have been some big shocks to the economy that have changed the fiscal outlook. There have been some big changes to policy that have changed the fiscal outlook, so it reflects that, yeah.
So that, I mean, to go back to your points earlier about trying to address the misconceptions out there that forecasts vary wildly between rounds, I would say is it not correct to say that between different rounds week to week there might not be that huge variance, but certainly between 6-month forecasts there is a large variance in terms of the context of the fiscal headroom. Yeah. Okay. Now, just turning to the macro picture on to productivity and to Professor Miles, we've spoken to you at previous appearances in this panel about your optimism on growth relative to other forecasters. Of course, the IMF, the Bank of England and others downgraded the UK's productivity in previous years, in the last 2 years, and there's been a lot of discussion about your decision to get downgrade now versus previously. So, wondering, could you reflect a bit on that decision now? In hindsight, it's very easy to say in hindsight, but in hindsight, do you still back your judgment that it was right to downgrade now and not earlier?
Professor Miles.
I do, but I would say that, wouldn't I? I think what we're trying to do, well, I know what we're trying to do, is to form an assessment of the underlying trend rate of growth of productivity. And underlying trend rate of growth of productivity is not something you can just look at the measured productivity as the ONS produces it and say, it's doing that, therefore the trend is this. And the reason is, I mean, as well as problems that have been particularly acute in recent years with measuring labour input, but setting that to one side, there are periods when there are major shocks to an economy, and COVID and the energy price shocks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine were two examples, COVID in particular, which generate huge fluctuations in measured productivity, sometimes huge reductions and then a bounce back, which actually tell you nothing about the trend rate of growth of productivity. So I think to try and reach a judgment, let's say a year ago, 2 years ago, when we were still quite close to the after effects, first of COVID and then of the energy price increase, would I think have been very difficult, because you'd be trying through a sort of fog of noise in the actual measured productivity, trying to infer something about the trend path that it might follow in the future. So it seemed to us that until you had left enough time to have gone past the aftermath of this temporary huge shock, particularly of COVID, but also with the energy price increase, with enormous increases in energy prices in 2022. Those increases in energy prices had, to a very large extent, been reversed, and in some sense gone away, by early 2023. Early 2023, mid-2023, was then, 3 years on from COVID's most dramatic impacts, which were in the middle of 2020. And so the view we took was that really, in order to not be influenced in the wrong direction by the aftermath of these big shocks, you have to wait for some of the dust on that to settle. By the middle of this year, 2025, we'd had about 2 years of what I would think of as data on productivity, which was unlikely to be seriously affected by those earlier shocks, and from which you could then make a judgment about whether there was going to be a bounce back to a upward sloping trajectory or not. And it turned out that although different measures show different things, none of the measures of productivity growth over the last 2 years or so, sadly, showed much higher productivity growth than they had in earlier periods after the financial crisis. And that, amongst some other things which I can describe in a moment, led to the view that we had been too optimistic in thinking that we would get a bounce back from those big shocks. In the lead up to those shocks, COVID in particular, in the period between about 2015 and 2019, productivity growth did seem to be rising a bit. And it looked like it might be on a trajectory that would get back to what was our immediate pre-COVID estimate of trend productivity growth. But that didn't seem to be showing up in the 2 years when, as I say, the dust had settled after COVID and the energy price shock. That's a long-winded explanation as to why I think we would have been jumping the gun and a bit too trigger-happy to reach this judgment, let's say, in 2023 or 2024.
Thank you.
And I appreciate there's something to be said for letting the dust settle.
Yeah.
How was this decision made institutionally? Was there a discussion, for example, among, I think you have around a dozen, is that right, economists working in the OBR? Was that a discussion? Was there a discussion on the committee between the three members of the committee?
Yes, absolutely. So to cut a long story short, I mean, we had 3 or 4 very good OBR economists working on pretty much nothing but this, looking at a range of different evidence from long periods back in history, from the most recent period, thinking about the effects of AI and how that might boost productivity in the future, trying to factor in the more recent negative impacts of tariffs on the UK and in general sort of deglobalization amongst trade across the world. We also drew on thoughts from, we have an advisory panel which is made up of academic economists, city economists, the leading think tanks, the IFS, the National Institute, and research institutes and the Resolution Foundation, all of whom have done very good work on productivity. We also had quite detailed discussions with Treasury economists who had themselves done very good work on productivity. And I mean, I had one-to-one conversations with probably two of the real experts on UK productivity, one of who was John Ranreenan, who was sitting in the Treasury, the other, one of my colleagues from Imperial College, Jonathan Haskell. So that process proceeded, you know, from the spring right through to the summer, and we sort of reached our preliminary judgment in the August, which actually then subsequently didn't change on what we were going to do.
So you have many conversations with both your 3 or 4 internal economists as well as all the external economists you mentioned, and having spent a lot of time among academic economists, I know that we're prone to disagree about many things. Ultimately, institutionally, is it down to you to make that decision, and it's you alone as opposed to any other member of the Budget Responsibility Committee?
Well, I take the lead on economic analysis, so it was perhaps likely that my colleagues would look to me to reach my own judgment first, but then to assess whether or not they agreed with it or thought it was still too optimistic, had become too pessimistic. So I think it was a decision of the Budget Responsibility Committee, but given that it was about an economic issue, and my role is to be, in some sense, the lead on economic issues, they kind of, I suppose I got a bit more weight than the others in the decision. But ultimately, it was a collective decision of the 3 of us, now 2 of us.
Does it tend to be on the committee that, for example, Mr. Josephs being the fiscal go-to gets the say over fiscal issues, that you get the say over macro issues? You kind of each keep to your own.
I wouldn't say.
Sorry,
I'm sorry to cut. Apologies. I wouldn't say, you know, you get to say in the sense that, you know, this is my judgment. I'm not interested in what you other 2 think, and Tom doesn't do that on the fiscal side. Tom knows much more about the fiscal issues and the complexities of the UK accounting for, you know, government spending here and what's on and off balance sheet. So I listen to him with interest and I learn a lot. Maybe he learns a bit about economics from me. I'm not sure that's true, actually.
I mean, just to add, all of the discussions that David went through there in terms of the discussions with staff on the productivity judgment externals, I mean, I was pretty much fully involved in all of that, as was Richard Hughes. And as David says, although he leads on macro, when it comes to making decisions, we basically do that by consensus.
The 3 of you make a consensus decision. Okay, that's really helpful to know. And just one small point on productivity, and you mentioned the view that Professor Miles, you mentioned the view that you've been too optimistic. There's this animal that's been invoked by journalists to describe this feature, the productivity porcupine, which, as you know, has spikes above it but not below it, meaning that productivity has only been revised downwards, and that you've been too optimistic, not just in this one instance, but over time. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I think what's happened over really the period since the financial crisis is there's been a collection of very big shocks, which have all turned out to be negative. The financial crisis itself, I mean, the financial system came close, you know, as we all remember, I think, to complete meltdown. I mean, the banking system simply stopped working. That is a huge negative effect on output. It didn't have such a big effect on employment. Huge slump in productivity and quite a lasting recession after that. I don't think that's actually an awful lot to do with trend productivity judgments into the future. But it would certainly mean that any forecast made just before the financial crisis looks ludicrously optimistic.
Thank you very much.
Same with COVID, to some extent the same with the energy price shock.
Thank you very much. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thanks, Chair. Professor Miles, we spoke about the difficulty for the government of numbers moving rapidly. For me, a major concern for me is that I was looking at your dynamic policy scoring document from 2023, that if I understand it correctly, the OBR doesn't score any fiscal multipliers from year 5 onwards. They assume government policy has no impact. I was looking at your productivity scoring analysis, and in your own paper you say that on the literature review that a 10% increase in UK R&D, some authors find a long-term effect on productivity of a 1.9% increase, which is enormous given the budget had a 16 billion downgrade from 0.3 reduction in productivity. So how can it be a responsible way for economic policy making if we're not allowing the government to take into account pro-growth measures?
Well, I think we do. I mean, for example, back at the time of the March fiscal event, where the government had some clear new policies for us to consider on planning and house building, we did factor those in. We got a projection of significantly stronger house building, and particularly in parts of the countries where there's a very clear housing shortage and houses are very expensive. And we factored that in, and it did affect our judgment about productive potential in the economy at the horizon. And we also said that it would become larger the further ahead you look than the 5 years over which the government's targets are assessed. So, I mean, I don't think it's quite right to say that we don't pay any attention to measures that the government thinks is pro-growth. Sometimes they fall beneath our what you might call threshold for is the effect of these things likely on our central forecast to be large enough 5 years down the road that it could confidently be considered significant. That threshold is 0.1% of GDP 5 years down the road. That's quite a small amount. I mean, it's about £3.5 billion in a £3.5 trillion economy. So that the threshold doesn't exclude things that could have a moderate but significant effect. Quite often, we may form a judgment that something that's unambiguously good news, I would say the India trade deal falls into this category, because it has quite a long time horizon before it builds up to its full effect, hasn't quite got there at the threshold. We don't so-called score it, but we can make it clear that we think this is something that has a meaningful effect, and it will become very likely above the threshold, just not within the 5-year horizon.
So am I interpreting this document then wrongly then when you say that there's...
Can you just refer which document you're talking about? So
the dynamic scoring of policy measures and OBR forecast from 9th November 2023 that assumes a fiscal multiplier of 0 for public investment.
No, okay, sorry, the multiplier is a slightly different judgment, if I may say. Apologies if we've been talking slightly at cross purposes. The multiplier judgment is in a sense an old style Keynesian thing. It's the government spends more on whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be pro-growth measures. It just cuts taxes, gives people more money. That's a boost to demand in the short run, and our judgment is that boost to demand nearly always has a positive effect on output in the short run. It may have no impact on what we call the underlying potential productiveness of the economy. So what it does is it boosts demand, but it doesn't really have much effect on how much could be produced in the UK. And it may well take demand above what you might call equilibrium output and be sort of slightly marginally inflationary. Our assumption is that those effects can play out over 2 or 3 years, but ultimately the Bank of England's role in a sense is to control inflation, which generally means bringing back demand in the economy in line with productive potential. And something that just boosts demand in the immediate short term, we take the view that the Bank of England will adjust to that to bring the economy back to what you might call equilibrium, so that demand is in line with the supply potential of the economy. And that would mean that the Keynesian demand effects, not trivial in the short run, tend to fade away if you look down the road.
Even though your own report here says that it has long-term effects.
Well, it only has government policies can have long-term effects if they change in a permanent way the productive potential of the economy. And the house building stuff, I think, is in that category. I think the India trade deal is in that category.
Thank you.
Thank you. And in your analysis, does your productivity forecast still come down essentially to a top-down judgment based on past trends, like we've discussed in previous sessions?
It certainly looks at past trends, actually quite long periods of history, like what happens after a big negative or positive shock in the UK. We draw upon that. I think it's also not just sort of backward looking, because we've made this assessment of the potential impact of huge improvements in artificial intelligence, and also on the negative side, a much less favourable trade environment as a result of tariffs levied by the US than it looked likely if you go back to the beginning of this year. So it's both what can you learn from history and what things now look different from history, and can we take account of those, both positive and negative?
Could you build is it possible to build a forward-looking bottom-up forecast of productivity? Because one of my concerns is that obviously these numbers have been so wrong over the last 15 years. Yep. That's creating a large impact on negative impact on government policy making.
No, I mean, you're right. It's a very, certainly when you look further down the road, it's a judgment that has significant impacts. I think it's also a judgment that you simply have to make, because you can't be agnostic about it and say we have no view on productivity. I mean, you need a number at least for the most plausible outcome about which there are huge risks. And one of the reasons why we've done some scenarios in the report we put out would be to answer the question, well, what would happen if productivity actually stayed much less than our forecast for the long run at about the average since the financial crisis? And the answer is that would be bad for GDP and it would make the fiscal situation much worse. Or we've downgraded our productivity forecast at exactly the wrong time, and we're about to see a period of the next 10, 20 years when productivity growth goes back to what it was in the 50 years up to the financial crisis, in which case things will be dramatically better than we think.
And you announced a new approach to scoring supply-side effect policies. In plain language, is it now more difficult for the government to get pro-growth impact policy included in the forecast, or easier to avoid anti-growth impacts?
I think we've set this threshold. I think we've set it at quite a low level. It was the 0.1% of GDP. It's, does it move the dial by about 3.5 billion, either plus or minus 5 years down the road? That's quite a low threshold. So it doesn't rule out us taking a view on all kinds of potential measures.
Can I just add on that?
Mr. Joseph.
I mean, it's symmetric. So I think, going to your question, it would apply to both policies that are positive for growth and policies that are negative for growth. And I mean, the reason that we have done this is that we had been looking at lots of policies which essentially were very, very small and really had very marginal impacts in both directions on growth at the end of our forecast. And we found ourselves making, essentially very small and uncertain adjustments to what is already a very uncertain view of productivity 5 years in 5 years' time. And therefore, we thought it made sense to be more transparent and more clear about what we mean by significance, which is why we introduced that threshold.
Thank you very much. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. The panel's already explained how the pre-measures forecast of 4 billion being the surplus isn't necessarily positive news for the country, but it could have been much worse if it wasn't for the growth in labour income. So could you explain to us what that was driven by, and how much of a surprise would that have actually been when you got to that stage?
I'll talk about just very quickly the economics and then how it feeds into the fiscal projections. I mean, it just looked like wage settlements this year, as we progressed through the year, had been turning out higher than we thought. I mean, it looks like wage settlements have still been running not far off 5%, even though the labour market has been weakening a bit, and vacancies have come down, and indeed very recently unemployment has edged up a bit. So it was a surprise that wage settlements seem to be hanging in at that level, and it looks like, looking at expectations of companies as to what settlements will be next year, that they'll also be a bit higher than we thought back in March. So that was the wage element of it. On the inflation front, a little bit the same story, that the inflation numbers through the course of this year have been coming in a bit stronger. So we've increased our assessment of inflation for next year by about 0.5%. We've increased our forecast about hourly earnings by a bit more than that. Both of those things, particularly in an environment where you've got ongoing threshold freezes on income tax, just bringing a lot of money.
Well, just to add on that, it is the case at the moment that, well, it's particularly the case at the moment that the receipts forecast is particularly sensitive to changes in inflation and nominal earnings because of the personal tax threshold freezes, which just means that for a given increase in inflation and earnings, you get a bigger boost to the receipts forecast than is the case if those thresholds were rising in line with CPI. There were also some other changes within the receipts forecast around the composition of growth, which is skewed more to consumption rather than to investment, which is also fiscally favourable because essentially consumption is taxed at a much higher effective tax rate than investment. In fact, investment has a negative effective tax rate because of capital allowances. And there are a few other factors within the receipts forecast that pushed it up, but alongside the change to earnings and inflation.
My follow-up question is, clearly this was positive news from the Chancellor's perspective of trying to meet her fiscal rules, but some have reported this as positive news for the economy overall. There was good news in there. To what extent are these factors good news? And particularly because I'm thinking about the fiscal drag element, how it's going to reduce people's disposable income, might have an impact on consumption. Inflation, obviously, we're actually trying to drive downwards at the moment, not least because of the impact on interest rates and other things. So, though this might have helped the Chancellor meet her fiscal rules on this occasion, is this actually good news for the economy overall?
I think if it was just inflation being higher and nominal wages higher, but not in real terms, just they would grow a bit more simply to keep up with inflation, that in itself is neither good news nor bad news. It's kind of neutral in a way. Of course, what it does is with the frozen thresholds, it actually effectively increases the tax rate on incomes because people will get pushed into higher bands. So if that's all that happened, it's really a way of just extracting more tax and not increasing the wealth of the country.
Just one thing to add also is we're just talking about the receipts side. So higher inflation and earnings does also mean higher welfare costs through benefit uprating. It does also mean more pressure on departmental spending budgets, which are fixed in nominal terms by the Treasury at spending reviews, and therefore higher inflation means less real spending power. That doesn't have a fiscal effect, if you like, unless the government adjusts those nominal totals, but it does have an effect on real spending power in the public sector.
We could see this real effect of this perhaps in future fiscal events.
Thank you very much for now, Mr. Dean. Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. My constituents will welcome the action on cost of living in the budget, from the rail freezes to the cuts to energy bills, but could you set out what the trajectory for real household disposable incomes is over the Parliament, how that change is compared to your forecast in March, and what the main reason for that change is?
Unfortunately, it's a bit less optimistic, and it's lower growth in real. If you take real household disposable income per person, seems to me the best measure, because it adjusts for population, it's in real terms, and it adjusts for taxes being taken off people. So if you wanted a sort of single number, real household disposable income per person seems a good one to me. It's a bit stronger this year than we thought, largely on the back of wage settlements being a bit stronger. But what happens further down the road really is that the judgment we've made on productivity to reduce it by about 0.3% every year or in terms of the growth rate, it's very difficult for that to not show up in lower growth of real household disposable income. And so looking beyond this year, the growth in real household disposable income is, around about 0.3 of 1%. Now, in the longer term history of the UK, certainly over the last 100 years, that's a very low number. But I think it's almost inevitable when, first of all, there's a significant fiscal tightening, and secondly, a judgment that we made, a difficult judgment, that the rate of growth of real productive potential in the economy is a bit lower.
Just on the measure, the RHDI, is it the most accurate measure of living standard? I ask because it includes imputed rents, it's gross of housing costs.
Yeah,
wouldn't a measure net of housing costs be more accurate?
The imputed rents thing can seem a bit weird. That why would you?
I think just anyone watching, just do you want to explain what imputed rents are?
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry.
We all know, but
imputed rents is the valuation placed on the services that people get from owning their own home and, in a sense, not having to pay rent. In one sense, that is a real source of income. That if people just decided, you'd pay rent to your neighbour and they'd pay rent to you, that would show up as rent and that would be income and it would show up in GDP. So just because people own their house doesn't mean that the services they get are any different. So the idea, which I think has some merit to it economically, is that you count the so-called imputed income that people get from the rental services of a house, and the only reason they don't pay rent on it is they actually own it themselves.
Including housing costs? Why would you include housing costs in it? Isn't a measure that doesn't exclude?
No, I don't think housing costs would. Yeah, I'm not quite sure that there's an obvious offset there. I mean, the real income from imputed income is a real thing. So, for example, if interest rates went up and people had to pay more on their mortgage, I mean, in some sense, that's a transfer. If you think about a bank or a building society that's getting deposits from UK households, interest rates go up. It's kind of a transfer from those who've got a mortgage to those who've got savings in the bank. That's distributional, but it doesn't affect the average level of real income in the country. So I think that's more a distributional thing. But I think your question is more subtle than that, but I need to think about it.
Maybe we could follow up.
Okay, maybe we could.
Can I just quickly turn to migration data, because the latest data is much lower than you forecast.
Yeah.
And I just wondered what the fiscal implications of that are.
I think it depends very much, and I don't know quite what the composition is of the people coming to the country more recently. It depends very much on who's coming. Are they people who come predominantly, they're going to work, they'll earn average incomes in the UK, maybe higher than average incomes in the UK, they'll become taxpayers very quickly. That, in the short run anyway, is positive. Those people, even if they have dependents, the dependents won't be eligible for welfare payments for some time. So the short run impact, if the great majority of people coming into the country is positive, and if those numbers go in the other direction and come down, and there's far fewer of those people coming in, then in the short run it's fiscally less favourable. Of course, what may have happened, and I haven't looked in detail at the very latest numbers, which only came out a few days ago, I think. It depends very much on the composition. So you could have a reduction in the number, but an increase in the proportion of people who are directly going to be working, and far fewer dependents, and maybe far fewer students who are not going to be generating any taxable income. So it depends on two things very much, I think, not just the absolute number of net migration. It's what kind of people are coming, what proportion of them are working, generating tax, what proportion of them are not. It also depends in the longer run about how long they stay, because after a certain period they will generally become eligible for welfare payments, and if they stay long enough, they'll ultimately be paid pensions.
Do you have all the necessary data in order to make that assessment based on?
I think we do on the very latest numbers, which, if I'm right, came out just within the last few days, the 204,000 number, which I think was much lower. I mean, I should say on the back of it that our forecasts have consistently been for a very sharp drop in net migration during the course of this year. We've come, and our forecasts were that you would dip below the Office for National Statistics estimate they made a little while ago about what the likely longer-term number of net migrants entering the country is. So we already thought we'd dip sharply beneath that. It's happened a bit more quickly than we thought. We thought it would happen in the course of next year, I think, and it's already happened in the numbers.
On this point, one of the characteristics of that recent data was the number of people leaving the country.
Yes.
And I wondered whether there is any data on what the tax take would be for the people who are leaving versus the tax revenues from the people who are coming in, and whether you're able to make any assessment of that at this point.
I mean, you're right. That's very important for thinking about the net fiscal impact. I have not seen yet, maybe Tom has, I have not seen yet a breakdown of the very large number of people leaving to know, how many of them were taxpayers, what were their average incomes. You need to know.
Is that something that you've asked for, Mr. Josephs?
So we haven't, I don't think we have seen that data, so we would have, that is something we would have to look at for our next forecast.
So it is possible you'll look at that for your next forecast. Yeah. Thank you. John Grady.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg. So I welcome the much higher headroom, but commentators point out that it's based on quite significant backloading. So savings of 24 billion in the final 2 years. Much of the tax is forecast to arrive almost 3 quarters after April 2029. We've also got the transfer of send provision from local government to central government. That's 6 billion or so. And defence spending is planned to increase, and there's a real question about, the level of threat versus defence spending. So against all of that, perhaps start with Mr. Josephs to give Professor Miles a rest. How confident are you that the target of a balanced budget on current account will be achieved in 29-30?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, a few points there. So, I mean, in terms of the target itself, as you say, the Chancellor's increased the headroom against that target quite significantly compared to the past. So 22 billion is almost double what it was in the past. And as we were discussing earlier, it's kind of roughly equal to our the average change in our forecast from event to event. It is important to underline that is a central forecast. So the risks are in both directions, both upside and downside risks. It is also the case, as you say, that the decisions in this budget have meant that the consolidation is more backloaded than was the case in the past. So policy decisions in this budget actually increase borrowing in the short term and only decrease borrowing right at the end, and therefore the kind of profile for the fall in borrowing and the fall in current budget has been pushed back. And yeah, there are a number of significant risks around that, a number of which we discuss in the reports. You've mentioned a couple on public spending, and there is the commitment on defence. That commitment the government has actually funded in the spending review period through a reduction in the development budget, but the ambition to go even further beyond the spending review period and meet the 3.5% target in the 2030s is clearly a significant pressure. We estimate that reaching that target in today's money is about 35 billion. But I mean, that is further off. I think that's 2035 by memory. You also mentioned the send pressure, which is a very significant one, more in the medium term. And the government has said, so that's spending on special education needs and disabilities, which has built up to become a very big pressure on local authority spending. And the government has said that from 2028-29, they will essentially fund all of that spending from within central government expenditure, but they haven't at the current time explained how that will be funded within the current envelope, so we've flagged that as a risk.
Just reflecting on the OBR since it came into being, in fact we've had several elections. The latest we can have an election is mid-August 2029, so you know that year, the year before it is when one would expect an election. So all this is backloaded into years of higher political risk. So against that background, coming back to my original question, perhaps for Professor Miles this time, given we've got an election, in your experience, do governments cut expenditure and raise taxes in election years?
I'm sure they don't want to. But then again, sometimes governments do things that are unpopular, and it turns out to be, you know, quite popular that people like their realism about what they've done.
Are you confident?
I mean,
are you confident, Professor Miles? How confident are you that these backloaded events will take place and will hit this headroom and this balanced current account?
Well, I think it depends on how determined the government is to stick to the plans to try and
you're both doing very well at not
target.
giving me much by way of confidence.
Maybe it's a question we can ask.
So I can go back to someone else. But just maybe last question. We're talking, and we've been talking since the OBR came into being, about forecasts of meeting a current account surplus, of paying down the national debt. And this is a serious issue because of the amount we pay on debt interest and resilience if we have future shocks, etc. So it's not just an academic topic.
Certainly not.
But we never actually seem to repay any debt. It seems to get bigger all the time. So we talk about forecasts. Are we reaching a point where we need to move beyond forecasts and actually we just need to start seeing actual repayments and debts rather than forecasting the future?
I mean, you're right that for many years now, the trajectory of government debt has been up and up and up.
Yeah.
And one thing you know for sure is that debt relative to GDP simply can't carry on doing that. I mean, ultimately, it will become unsustainable. And in our report that we sort of put out in the summer every year, which takes a much longer horizon, we show some pictures which in some sense are very frightening, because they say that on current policies, on current tax policies and spending, if they just continue into the future, the stock of debt relative to GDP will rise inexorably and get to a level that clearly is unsustainable within a few decades down the road. So at some point, there needs to be a really sustained effort, not just to have the stock of debt rise and rise and rise and rise and rise and then just turn down ever so slightly 5 years down the road, but something much more significant than that. Otherwise, the thing will become unaffordable, unsustainable.
Could I just add one thing on that? I mean, a related point is the path of borrowing, which you were asking about earlier. And it is the case that essentially since the pandemic was over, borrowing in the UK has been basically stuck at around 5% of GDP. And successive governments have had plans to, similar to the ones you'll see in the report today, to have borrowing falling over the medium term. And that has not happened. Borrowing has remained about 5% of GDP with the implications for debt that David's talking about. I mean, that's been a combination of kind of shocks or bad news on the economy coming along, but also changes in government plans. But I think, you know, you raise a very important point here about the actual position of the public finances now, rather than always focusing on what's happening in the forecast.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bailey. Chris Coughlin, MP.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Joseph, you state in the EFO that the government will reduce SEND funding by 2.2 billion in 29-30. The Department of Education have put out a statement saying the OBR is fundamentally wrong, and that it will not come out of the core schools budget, and the projections do not take into account detail for their reforms. Do you agree with the DFE, and will SEND funding not in fact be cut?
So a couple of things on that. I mean, one is that we have to produce our forecast based on announced government policy, and the government has not announced a plan for reforming SEND at the current time. You know, their intention is to do that, I understand, in the new year, but you know, there were no details that would have allowed us to score anything in this report. What they have announced is that this very, very large pressure, I mean, £6 billion we estimate, will be moved from the local authority sector into central government sector. They did not set out how that would be funded, and that is in a year when there are other significant pressures on the existing spending review envelope, including from inflation, as I was talking about earlier, but also other areas of spending pressure. And it's also a year where the government has actually decided to try and reduce overall spending a bit compared to the past. So, you know, it is clearly a risk. And as a result, we decided to, we always have an assumption on the amount by which we think departments will underspend their allocations. And on the basis of these pressures, including SEND, we decided to take that down to 0, which is, I think, the first time we've ever done that. On the point that the Department for Education is making, you know, we have a duty in legislation to set out risks to the fiscal forecast. The government had not told us in that year how they were going to fund this, where any offsetting savings came from, and therefore, in order to illustrate the scale of risk and pressure this created, we illustrated the implications for mainstream school spending if, and there is an if there, it was all in the Department for Education's budget.
Thank you very much. But you scored it on the schools, the schools budgets as well. Did you?
Well, we, I mean, we don't produce a bottom-up department by department forecast. We didn't make a bottom-up assumption on that because the government just told us it would be absorbed within overall government spending. It didn't tell us how it would fund it. So what we did was provide an illustration of the risk and pressure.
It was only an illustration. So I think as the government had put in the red book something about that it would come from across government spending.
Yeah, but because they did, we have to illustrate risks, and so we chose to do it, which I think is reasonable, by illustrating the impact it would have on the schools budget.
Thank you very much for making that clear. Ben MP.
Can I ask you about efficiencies in government? It seems to me that the budget highlighted an additional 4.9 billion of efficiencies, building on what we had in the spending review, which was, I think, 14 billion of efficiencies. Can you tell us about your sort of confidence level in achievement of those? It's easy to project as an extra 2% in NHS productivity, for example, but how credible are they based on what is actually attained? It seems often people assert that to make up the numbers, but then it doesn't happen.
Yeah, so I mean, we have not built into our projections of public spending a sort of assumption in our numbers on the difference that those efficiency targets will make. Essentially, as you know, we take the government's overall plans that it sets at spending reviews for departments. What we do, as I've been explaining, is make an assessment of the risk that we think there is within those envelopes, and we, on the basis of that, adjust these underspend assumptions that I'm talking about, but we also try and illustrate in the book where there are risks and pressures beyond that. And I think, you know, it's certainly the case that there are a number of new pressures that have come in to departmental spending since the spending review allocations were made, and that is why, as I said, we've reduced these underspend assumptions, not just in that final year that I was talking about, but actually across the whole of the spending review period. And you know, that it does mean that if the government wants to achieve those plans, these efficiency plans will need to play a really important part in that. I say we've not made a sort of detailed assessment of those efficiency plans ourselves, but
if you're talking about a 16% increase in back office, reduction in back office costs in the civil service by 4 years' time, that's quite an ambitious number to aim for.
I mean, it is the case, obviously, that in the past, governments have been able to reduce departmental spending, most notably in the 2010s. And at that time, a big part of that was efficiency savings. So, yeah, there is evidence that it can be done, but it's certainly always challenging. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think I have many stories about challenge that could be. I wanted to move on now to Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. One of the risks of the fiscal forecast that you've highlighted in the report is about the potential for a correction in the global stock market. We're hearing news this morning that UK pension funds are starting to dump US equities. There's a general sort of fear that we might have an AI bubble. I just wondered if you could talk us through those risks and in particular how it might impact the government's fiscal mandate.
Those risks certainly exist, and I think we did two different scenarios, one in which there's a really substantial adjustment. I think it was 35% for in equity prices. That's right across the world, so it includes UK stocks. The other was, if you will, a shock that emanates from somewhere else, but there's a sort of smaller knock-on effect in the UK. That was sort of motivated by the idea. So, and in that one, 35% in the rest of the world, but only 15% in the UK. And that was because on a lot of different measures, UK stocks just look less overvalued than they do in a lot of other countries, particularly the US. And the scale of that is very, very marked at the moment. So the US, one measure of valuation is what are the price of stocks relative to the earnings of companies, the so-called PE ratio. That's not far off twice as high in the US as it is in the UK. So it seems sensible to say, well, there could be an adjustment in the world. It's probably going to be bigger in the most overvalued markets. The UK is definitely not in the overvalued markets in the world, but you couldn't plausibly think that a very big sell-off in the global markets wouldn't have any impact on the UK. So we do both of those. We don't try and identify what it is that causes this. Obviously, the thing that you highlight is very much in the minds of many people, that some sort of tech stocks, IT stocks, call them what you will, look like they're very stretched in terms of valuations, and people are getting nervous about that. So it could be that, but we're not specific. And we just then try and trace through what it does to both the economy, but also through direct links to government revenue, and impacts, for example, on the valuation of the stocks held by local authority pension schemes, which then has an impact on one of the fiscal measures, which is public sector net financial liabilities. So a big fall in value of stocks, given that they are big holders, those local authority pension funds, big holders of stocks, that's going to flow straight through to that measure, public sector net financial liabilities. And the impacts are big. I mean, just on the current balance, I think it's a deterioration by about 16 billion or so. I mean, that's as much as our estimated impact from the productivity downgrade on the current balance if you got 35% off equities all over the world. It's a little bit better if it's the rest of the world has a big hit, we have a smaller hit. It's not 16 billion off, it's 9 billion off. So do you want to add something on the fiscal stuff?
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you. We obviously the gambling taxes were changed in the budget. I'd be interested to know how you score those, because obviously there's an awful lot of behavioural changes, and we had from the gambling industry a suggestion that people would be pushed, for example, to the black market, so they still gamble, or equally there's a possibility of a shift of type of gambling if taxes are put on. So how do you go about scoring that, and what were the any particular messages you've got?
Yes, thank you. So this was quite a complicated measure to cost, and there are a number of assumptions in there on behaviours. And the changes create quite a number of different rates across different forms. It is. So there's across different forms of gambling, which we also had to consider the impact of that on behaviour. I mean, essentially the main behaviours that we assumed, and this was based on studies that HMRC has done in the past, but also updated looking at international examples of where gambling tax has changed recently, of which there are quite a few examples, is, I mean, I guess the big one is that operators will pass on a lot of the cost of the tax increase to their customers, and that would lead to a reduction in demand, which reduces the yield from the measure by a reasonable amount. That does build in some behaviour of people moving into the illicit market. I mean, the evidence we had from those other countries that have introduced reforms recently is that that is not huge. They didn't see huge evidence that that has happened, especially if if you have a well-regulated gambling market as we do here. That the opportunities to do that are relatively limited, and generally, people don't want to do that if they can because of the obvious risks involved. And then we did also have an assumption that there would be some substitution between the different forms of gambling, reflecting the fact that you do now have some quite wide differentials between the tax applied on what are essentially quite closely related forms of gambling. And we also made an assumption that the operators would, over time, be able to adjust their sort of product offering to essentially kind of maximise profits and kind of minimise the tax.
So you mean, perhaps from what you're saying, so the online gambling, which this committee put a report about, online gaming, which we felt caused more harm, and therefore that we urged the government to look at differentiation. You think that they offer you've factored in that they might try and encourage some of those people to go, for example, to a betting shop or the races or a casino? Is that really realistic? How?
Yeah, so I should say it's a relatively small effect, but we do think it is likely over time that there would be some of that behaviour would take place.
Very difficult to score, though.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one which there is a big amount of uncertainty basically about that behavioural response, but I do think it is one where HMRC have actually done some really, really detailed work, both using their own analysis from the past, but also, as I say, taking account of international evidence.
Well, we'll maybe raise it with them when they're in front of us in January. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Josephs. Luke Murphy, MP.
There were new taxes to electric vehicles applied in the budget. I wonder if you could just set out what the scope of these taxes are to, or tax more specifically, to plug the fiscal gap created by reduction in fuel duty revenue.
Yeah, so we've got some analysis of that in the report. We have for a long time flagged in our long-term risks report the big risk to government revenues from the loss of fuel duty over time as the government shifts to meet its climate change objectives through the electrification. And so we do some analysis of the offset that the new EV charge will create. And what we show is that essentially it offsets around a quarter of the lost revenue from fuel duty over the long term. And that the reason it's not 100% is because the EV charge that the government has set is roughly half the charge on the average driver through fuel duty. And also at the current time, it only applies to cars and not to vans and lorries, which vans and lorries account for, I think, well, it's close to half of all fuel duty receipts. So those two factors, lower rate and only applying to cars, is why it only replaces around a quarter of the revenue from fuel duty.
Would your expectation be that the charge will have to increase in future in order to fill that gap and potentially be extended to vans and lorries?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a decision for future governments, not for us, but yeah.
You predict a kind of reduction in EV car sales of around just over 400, well, nearly 450,000 as a result of the measure, which is offset, I think, by other government policies to kind of increase sales. I just wonder whether that reduction in sales could be bigger than envisaged. How confident are you around the modelling of the impact of the policy change?
Well, again, it's quite an uncertain behavioural response, and there are quite a lot of moving parts there. There's the actual new charge on electric vehicles and the impact that has on purchasing decisions on electric vehicles. There are also, as you say, offsetting policies that the government's introduced to try and incentivise purchases. So through grants and through some other changes to taxation that will reduce costs. And then there is also the interaction with the electric vehicle mandate, which, as you know, mandates manufacturers have to sell a rising proportion of their vehicles as electric vehicles. And so essentially the interaction of all of those moving parts leads us to this judgment that overall, on a net basis, sales of EVs will be about 100,000 lower than they otherwise would. But I definitely would say it's, that is very dependent on assumptions you make, both on the manufacturer's responses and also customers' responses.
There's significant risks around the figure.
So there's definitely risk around that.
And on fuel duty, the budget states that from April 2027, the government will uprate fuel duty by RPI. But as we know, fuel duty rates have been frozen for 15 years. How much headroom would the government lose if it did not go ahead with that fuel duty uprating by RPI?
Yeah, so I think this is now the 16th consecutive time that those rates have not changed. The cumulative cost of that since 2010, we estimate, is about 120 billion. 120 billion cumulative cost since 2010. I think in this forecast, if those rates were not uprated, it would cost about 3.5 billion a year.
And say fuel duty weren't uprated, does that have a potential impact on demand of EVs, and do you model that?
It would do. I mean, essentially, it sort of lowers the cost of petrol and diesel vehicles relative to EVs. Again, the modelling that I was describing earlier on electric vehicles, we have to base on current government policy, so it will have been based on the assumption that those RPI increases happen.
That number on EV forecast could change in the negative if government weren't to freeze RPI. Well, weren't to freeze fuel duty, sorry.
Yes, but there is, as I say, there's also the interaction with the mandate. So manufacturers still have to sell a certain proportion of their vehicles as electric vehicles. So again, there would be a response to that from manufacturers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy. Yuan Yang, MP.
Yes, there are several increases on the effective rate of tax from income flowing from wealth in the last budget, and in particular on the effective rate of tax on dividends. And I see that in your behavioural effect, you find that over the 5-year forecast period, there's the effect of people changing their behaviour in response to that tax increase goes down to zero. Was that a surprising find, and would you have found a zero impact on behaviour if that increase had been larger than 2 percentage points? Mr. Joseph.
Specifically on the increase to dividends?
On dividends, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reflects the fact that it was a relatively small increase. It applies just to basic and higher rate taxpayers and not to additional rate taxpayers. And I think it is the case that actually quite a lot of the dividend taxes will be paid by additional rate taxpayers. So yeah, essentially that's why there was not a huge one.
Thank you very much indeed. Harry.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm going to try and elicit some yes/no answers out of you, because you've obviously covered a lot of ground so far, and I think there are a few last topics where I'd just like to get a yes/no from you. First of all, the Chancellor has told us repeatedly about the importance of growth. In aggregate, did the measures announced in this week's budget improve growth in the UK? That's a yes/no answer, please.
No, but can I just say why?
Yes.
No, in the sense that we didn't judge that the positive effects outweigh the negative effects. I think it's in some ways not surprising that the answer is no, because if you're going to take the tax take out of GDP higher again, which happens to the highest level certainly since the Second World War, possibly for a much longer period, it's very difficult to raise taxes without affecting incentives to save, to work, to invest, to become an entrepreneur, to stay in the UK. It's very difficult to do that without having some negative effects. We judged that those negative effects, at least over a 5-year horizon, were not large enough to actually give a negative impact of the budget, but neither did any positive effects more than outweigh them.
In short, higher taxes mean lower growth, is what I heard.
Very
Say
difficult
there,
to increase the tax take without having effects on incentives. Yeah.
Okay, another quick one for trying for a yes/no. In aggregate, did the measures in this week's budget improve productivity in the UK, Mr. Josephs?
Well, again,
Yes, no.
Well, I think it's
Well,
difficult.
it
I think we need to get a little bit maybe more reflective than.
again, I think the answer is the same answer that David just gave, which is no, but there is a reason why, which is that we have introduced this new significance threshold. So we only incorporate the impact of policies on productivity if they go above or below our 0.1 threshold. And in this budget, there weren't any policies in
Lots
either
of small, the
direction.
smorgasbord meant that it's not a score.
So it didn't increase growth, it didn't change productivity of the UK economy. Specifically on NHS productivity, because it's such a big line item in the budget, the spending on the NHS. In previous reports, you've told us that NHS productivity has not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. Is that still the case? Can I have a yes/no on that?
I mean, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that because that is not a number we've included in the book this time. I know there have been some recent data releases on that, but sorry, I can't give you an
I
answer.
need to chip in that my local hospital, Homerton, has increased productivity by 11.3% year on year. So there are bits of the NHS that are doing very well.
Very good. If I may, just I've got a couple more. On the Employment Rights Bill, is it my understanding you have not yet incorporated any impact of the Employment Rights Bill in your forecast? Yes. Okay. And then finally, on a point that we were talking about earlier, the net migration mix, we heard that you don't have a lot of information yet on that. You also told us in your report last year at the budget that the measures that the Chancellor put in place then around the non-domiciled regime were highly uncertain. And I think in this year's report you've said that you've no reason to change that. There's been a lot of anecdote obviously out there about rich people fleeing the country, but is there any sort of fact-based information that would change any of your information?
And so, as you say, we've not changed that assumption because we don't feel there's any hard evidence out there that would lead us to change that assumption. I mean, that assumption is that there is pretty significant outward migration as a result of that policy. But as I say,
still within the parameters you estimated.
Yeah, no new evidence, and we won't have really hard data on that until early 2027 when we start to see the actual tax receipts.
And then final one, if I may, the salary sacrifice measures in terms of pensions were the second biggest item in terms of the tax increases in this budget. Do you think that that will have a long-term impact in terms of your medium-term fiscal forecast and the amount that we save for pensions in this country? Yes.
A long-term impact, well, I think you would expect it to have an impact over the long term. I mean, it does reduce the tax benefits of the salary sacrifice route to pension saving, and over the long term, therefore, you may expect lower pension savings than you otherwise would have done. I mean, there are obviously lots of other routes through which people can get the tax benefits of salary of saving into a pension, and we do, and you know, the costing assumes that people will move into other routes.
Thank you very much. Luke Murphy, MP.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a question about the significance threshold on policies. I just wondered, do you only ever assess what the government puts in front of you, or do you have a kind of a basket of measures, as it were, that you, or a range of different types of policy that you publish that you could show makes the biggest difference in terms of growth enhancing measures? How does that process work?
We only consider policies that the government has announced as final policy decisions, And I mean, that's something that's set by our legislation. We're not permitted to look at alternative policies. I would say one point here is that I think one of the issues we have faced when undertaking these sort of exercises of incorporating the impacts of government policy is how can we be assured that we are being given a sort of full picture of the various changes in government policy that might have an impact on growth. And I think in particular that is an issue for us when it comes to departmental spending policy and regulatory policy. On tax and welfare rate changes, you know, essentially fiscal events bring everything together, so we can be very confident we're looking at all tax and benefit rate changes. When it comes to departmental spending, for example, we might be told by the government that a department is introducing a new spending policy that's going to have a positive impact on growth. It is very difficult for us to look through everything else that department is doing and judge whether other things that department might be doing might be having a offsetting effect on growth. So that's one of the reasons we've introduced this significance threshold, and we've also been clearer on another one of our thresholds, which is we call additionality, which is essentially saying, can we be sure that this new policy is having an impact on growth which is clearly over and above previous government efforts and is not being offset by other policy changes.
I appreciate you only assess the policies the government puts in front of you, but I guess to ask the question slightly differently, do you have a typology of policy measures that shows how you assess different types of policies with it in-house? And
Yes,
that's something that you
so we do.
Is that something that you publish?
We do, and we've published the published report, which basically shows how we approach different types of policy.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John Denham.
Can I just ask you on the employment rights bill? I mean, it was in ping pong immediately before the budget, but I suppose the U-turn on Wednesday on first day rights would vindicate your position on that.
Yeah. So back in March, we said that this policy was the final picture on that policy was very uncertain because it had to go through a legislative process. There were a lot of amendments in play, and also quite a lot of the important details would only come in secondary legislation. We thought by the time of this forecast we'd have a clearer view. As it turned out, that was not the case. It was still going through this process. So we judged we were still not able to estimate the impact on growth, and as you say, there have been subsequent big changes. Yeah.
I think it's clear. So in legislation, you can only deal with policies of the government, and the same really for legislation has to be finally pinned down.
Well, we do score policies where the legislation is still going through Parliament, where it's in most cases is pretty clear what the final outcome is going to be. In this case, that was just not the case.
So the number of amendments.
And also the fact that a lot of important details would come from the secondary legislation that followed the primary.
There's a message for government, isn't it, about what to put on the face of a bill, and in secondary legislation. If you're in government, you always want it. In secondary legislation, if you're in opposition, you always want it on the face of the bill. But before we finish, I just want to ask a couple of quick questions. One of the we haven't talked much about gilts today, but we've seen the pattern of gilt trading here. But one big question is, why are the UK gilts rates consistently higher than in France, which has, you know, far more debt than even we do?
I think part of the reason is that UK gilts obviously are denominated in sterling and French government bonds in euros, and the euro is a clearly more widely held global currency than sterling. There'll be a lot of investors that think some part of their portfolio needs to be in euro-denominated assets. There'll be relatively fewer, at least outside the UK, who would think, yes, we absolutely have to have some sterling-denominated government bonds. I think that's one reason. I suppose there's a slightly more nebulous one, that if things really fiscally got very difficult in France, that there might be some European Union ECB strategy to try and help them. That's not going to come our way.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Going back to what we were discussing at the beginning, you were very clear about the unhelpful information that you felt was being put out there If that unhelpful briefing occurs at a future fiscal event, I think it's clear that the committee would be quite like to be informed of that. Are you happy to support that as members of the Budget Responsibility Committee? Obviously, you'll have a new chair, would have to be involved in that discussion too. Is that something, Mr. Josephs, you'd support? Providing information if you felt that the OBR was being buffeted by briefings?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of actual briefing, it's obviously quite often very difficult for us to know exactly what is happening and who is briefing and what.
Well, it could be wild speculation, it could be media speculation, it could be briefings, could be leaks, all of those, but all the noise around it, I think, is my point.
I think one thing I might add to the discussion we had earlier when you were asking about the letter is one thing that was upmost in our minds when we considered writing that letter was the expectation that this committee would be asking us questions about what had happened, because you have done that previously, and therefore that was part of the thinking about in terms of putting it down on paper so it was clear.
Yeah, get it out early.
And we also had questions from the Shadow Chancellor as well. So
okay. And what about you, Professor Miles? Would you support providing us with that information in future?
I would. I mean, the OBR is here to serve this committee, and if you find that information helpful, we should respond to it.
Thank you very much. And did you ever feel, I'll push you a little bit more on this, that the Chancellor or any Treasury Minister gave an incorrect impression to journalists or the public about the information that you had supplied to them?
I think there were misunderstandings in the media, but that's not something I would pin down.
I'm not sure where it came from.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And Mr. Joseph?
Yeah, I think the same. Like, it's very difficult for us, and we are not here to comment on government communication or on what then led to media speculation. The purpose of the letter, as we've discussed, was to sort of set out the facts in terms of the evolution of our forecast. Everything else that happened is really not something for us to, I think, sort of reach judgment on.
Well, thank you very much. And can I thank our witnesses very much indeed. That's Tom Josephs and Professor David Miles of the Budget Responsibility Committee at the Office for Budget Responsibility. This is the first of 4 sessions around the budget. So tomorrow we have a group of economists. Next Tuesday we have the Bank of England, and on Wednesday we have the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The transcript of this session will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days. And once again, I thank our witnesses. Order, order.
you.